Death Mage Chapter 123, they're coming, but let's prioritize going south for now.
A number of the guys who will possibly become my enemies, the reincarnated individuals, have died in origin, about 10 of them.
Upon hearing Vandalu's words, everyone's eyes suddenly sharpened and became tense.
10 people like that Kaido Koinata person. Your Majesty, we must kill them as quickly as possible. Please calm down, we don't know where they are yet. I understand how you feel, but it's impossible to go and search the entire continent.
These two were the only ones who had seen a reincarnated individual other than Vandalu in person. That reincarnated individual, Kaido Koinata, had been quite the degenerate. He had repeatedly committed senseless murders and rapes before he showed himself before Vandalu. On top of that, he had used extremely dirty methods, such as getting on his knees to try and make Vandalu let his guard down. However, in the end, he had been tormented and killed without being able to land a single blow back against Vandalu, and he had been extinguished by having his soul broken. But the ability that Koinata had received from Rodekort Agunir had been powerful. It was a penetration ability that allowed the user to choose objects to phase through. It was theoretically possible for attacks to be one-sided, passing through any kind of armor, walls, or spells. Depending on the object to be phased through, it could consume large amounts of mana, but the ability itself didn't have any weaknesses. The reason Vandalu had been able to defeat Koinata in a one-sided fashion was because Koinata had completely underestimated Vandalu, and because he had used Agunir recklessly when committing his crimes, giving information regarding the ability to the spirits of Ahana and his other victims. In other words, if the other reincarnated individuals possessed cheat-like abilities as powerful as Koinatis, but were careful, cautious, and patient unlike him, they could become formidable enemies.
Special life forms that have acquired the divine protection of the god of reincarnation, Master. Once you kill them, could I please receive pieces of their flesh or their hair, or even their ashes if that is not possible?
Luciliano, you're being too hasty. We don't know where they are yet either.
For now, let's think about things after we hear what Van Kun has heard from this, Allegian-chan. I don't really understand these cheat-like ability things.
It's a long story.
He told everyone everything that he had heard from Allegian. Because he'd gained almost no information from the previously defeated Kaido Koinata, this was the first substantial information that he had received regarding the reincarnated individuals. And for Vandalu himself, this was the first information that he had gained regarding what had happened in Origin after his death. Honestly, he didn't care about what had happened after he died in a world where he had spent his whole life as an experimental animal, until he turned into an undead and went on his rampage. However, the fact that the entire world had fallen into chaos after the loss of death attribute mana, and the fact that the military nation in which the research laboratory was had been dismantled, was good news. But the fact that the other experimental animals that he had saved were secured by Amemiya Hiroto and the others, only to be handed to a different laboratory to become experimental animals again later, was not good news. According to Allegian, Amemiya Hiroto and the others had formed something like an international rescue team, just as Vandalu had predicted. Weren't they a little too incompetent?
Well, when I saved them, I accidentally gave them some of my death attribute mana, so I'm not entirely irresponsible for the fact that they became experimental animals again, but...
Ooh. Wait, Allegian, I know you're trying to say that it's not his fault, but Vandalu's going to be buried.
Leaving aside the question of how effective Amemiya Hiroto and the others were as superheroes, it was difficult to say that the deaths of the reincarnated individuals that followed were good news for Vandalu as well.
The 3 who died after Kaido Koinata, the Iskender Tainaka, the Order Maikenzi, the Upsias Sameishima. What happened to those 3? If they died within a few months after Kaido Koinata, then almost 2 years should have passed after they were reincarnated here.
One had an ability that accelerated time around the user to enable high-speed movement. One had an ability that allowed the user to look into past events that had occurred within a designated space. The other had an ability whose principles were not known, but could stop the movement of any target the user was aware of. Vandalyu didn't know what criteria were used to decide the Abravers, code names, so he thought that Sameashima should have been named Moedusa rather than Upsius, but thought that Sameashima might have been opposed to that, as he was apparently a man.
Unlike Kaido Kanata, I can imagine that they were reincarnated normally as babies, but it's possible that they were reincarnated into adult bodies, found out that Kanata was killed and then decided to change their plans. It's possible that they are gathering their strength in preparation to kill me. They're a fearsome group of people.
Vandalyu said from among Allegiant's arms and legs, urging his companions that these enemies could be a threat in a serious manner.
Your Majesty, is there a possibility that they fear you and are in hiding or have escaped to another continent?
The truth was that her suggestion was quite close to reality. As a result of the chaos in Origin caused when Kanata's evil deeds became known, and the Metamorph, Shiho and Mari took things into her own hands, Tonaka and the other two had been on missions on their own, where they were forced into extremely unfavorable situations and made fatal mistakes on top of that. Even the fortunes that Rodecourt had given them hadn't allowed them to survive. The truth was that the Avalon Rakudo Hijiri had manipulated information to have these three sent on solo missions in order to experiment and find out what it would take for reincarnated individuals to die. However, only Rodecourt, the three individuals themselves, and those who had died after them knew of this. And after learning about all of this, Toinaka and the other two felt not anger and hatred, but fatigue from a life full of fighting. And the Ogonir, Kaido Koinata, had been one of the most capable reincarnated individuals when it came to combat. After finding out that even Koinata had been defeated by Vandalyu one-sidedly, Toinaka and the other two had decided that they couldn't defeat Vandalyu, so they had refused to get involved with him and were reincarnated normally as babies. But Kimberly, a former soldier, and Basedia, who had strong warrior-like thoughts after she learned how to use magic, didn't seem to think that this would be the case.
No, it's not wrong to assume the worst possible situation.
And they're self-named heroes with titles of heroes from other worlds, aren't they? It seems that Kanata was quite the lowlife, but there is no guarantee that the others will be the same.
The two of them had images of the Abravers being a fearsome group of warriors with a persistent fighting spirit and a conviction of steel. Allegiant didn't make any attempts to correct them. Neither the members of the 8th Guidance nor the Agazer, Miyanuma Hitomi, knew what kind of personalities Toinaka and the other two had. Back when they died, the 8th Guidance had begun their activities and started collecting information, and they were Agazer, Miyanuma Hitomi's former allies, so they at least knew their names and abilities. However, this was information that had already been announced to the world. Thus, they didn't know what kind of people they had really been. And even Murakami and his group hadn't deemed it necessary to gather information about dead people, so they hadn't been investigated in detail. In addition, as it had only just been reincarnated, Allegiant was not particularly adept in understanding the Japanese that was being used in Alamda. It was the language that the Abravers used primarily, so the 8th Guidance had learned it to some extent, but only to a certain extent. They could read the characters, but they could only gain partial understanding of conversations when words were spoken too quickly.
Indeed, I do not know what kind of a world Origin is, but if they are all degenerates like that Kanata, then they could hardly call themselves heroes, could they?
It was common for people to have natures that were different from what their appearances would suggest. Olivia had experienced being tricked and murdered 200 years ago by Duke Hartner, so she knew this all too well. However, it seemed that she thought there wouldn't be too many people as evil as Koinata. In reality, there were some who were not so different from Koinata, like Emarionette and Death Scythe, but since they had been told by Rodecourt just how Kaido Koinata died, there was a chance that they would act cautiously and hide their true natures.
So, what kind of people are the reincarnated individuals other than those three?
It seems that Legion knows a little about their personalities in addition to their names and abilities. Legion allied itself with them, though it was under the assumption that they would be betrayed, until they started killing each other.
Considering its appearance, it seems that it can express itself quite well.
Eleonora said, impressed despite Allegiant having an appearance that made it doubtful as to whether it was intelligent.
It has a lot of stomachs, after all.
That's not what I meant, Povina.
TLN, the word for express oneself that Eleonora used includes the kanji for stomach. Pavina started hugging Allegiant. It seemed that Elijin didn't dislike being hugged.
For now, I'll explain things through words. Yamata, please hand out the documents.
As Vandalyu explained verbally, Yamata handed out documents that contained the same information that he was explaining. She was a Apachuk Hydra, a zombie, created by decapitating the heads of a mutant Hydra and replacing them with the upper bodies of 9 beautiful women of different races.
Distribute. Many lots. Struang.
She seemed to be interested in Elijin, who had many upper body parts like she did.
Oh.
Elijin was simply bewildered by the fact that it was gathering interest. Meanwhile, Vandalyu continued his explanation. The inspector, Shiamata Iazumi, who sees through any falsity that she perceives through her 5 senses. The Laplace's Idiman, Machida Aran, whose calculation ability was greater than a supercomputer. The Inoa Mao Smith, who could store and transport a great amount of materials and personnel in a special space. The Oracle Enido Koia, who could receive prophecies from a god. The Emarionette Yenui Hajime, who could take control over the body of anyone he touched. The Death Ascythe Koinoe Miyagi, who could stop the heart and cause instant death in anyone whose face he could see. The Isulfid Emisa Anderson, who could transform her body into gas. The Isuper Essence Goito Kaoru, who could strengthen her 5 senses at will. The Odin Hazoamada Akira, who could see a few seconds into the future. The Clairvoyance Tenedo Tatsuya, who possessed numerous vision-related abilities such as X-ray vision. The Mage Emesher Miyanami Asagi, who could erase the effects of all kinds of magic. The Ifrit Akaki Showako, who could manipulate heat and flames. These were the deceased Abravers that Elijin was aware of. In reality, 4 more, the Akronas Murakami Junipei, the Evinus Tsuchiya Kainako as well as Hekatunkair and Aegis, had died as well. But Elijin didn't know about this because the last 8th guidance member to die, Pluto, had died before any of them. Also, the information that Elijin had provided Vandalyu regarding the functions of some of their Bravers' abilities was not accurate. This was because the 8th guidance that made up Elijin didn't possess the correct information regarding those abilities. After hearing this explanation, everyone present had a mutual opinion.
Vansama, I don't really understand what the calculation ability is.
Tareya said, mentioning what was on everyone's mind. Of course, the concept of computers didn't exist in Alamda. The field of physics was underdeveloped as well, and the mathematics level of the average person didn't go beyond basic arithmetic.
As I thought, it's an ability that allows super-fast calculations.
That might be amazing, but what use does it have?
Anyone can calculate how many times they can cast their spells and use their martial skills with their remaining mana.
Aborkus said, looking perplexed. Everyone else had similar expressions. It wasn't that they thought that a calculating ability would be useless. However, they couldn't be blamed for thinking it strange that it would be an ability given by a god, worthy of being a unique skill. A professional architect might have understood how valuable it was to some extent, but the only such person in Talosheim was Vandalyu. And since Vandalyu had been nothing more than a high school student on Earth, he didn't possess advanced knowledge in physics or mathematics, so it seemed that he couldn't explain this in detail.
It's probably useful for advanced construction and public works.
He said with a vague memory of past knowledge, still not knowing exactly how it was used.
Is that right?
He and the others seemed convinced by this explanation. Well, they did have some doubts as to why someone with such an ability was considered a hero, but they quickly decided that there were some who played roles other than in battle.
If the others have only 1 power each, then it seems like things might work out, as long as we're not taken by surprise.
Yeah, and some of them are clearly inferior versions of Vandalyu-kun.
No, my abilities are magic.
The fact that you can easily recreate the effects of unique skills using magic is amazing.
Just like the previously exterminated Ogongnir, Kaido Kainata, if the reincarnated individuals only possessed a single cheat-like ability each, then it seemed like something could be done about them. Especially for Vandalyu. Even if Death Ascythe's instant kill cheat-like ability stopped his heart, he could simply fight while using out-of-body experience. After that, he would just need to resuscitate his cardiovascular system before any fatal damage was done to his brain. The same applied for a marionette. It was apparently an ability that manipulated others by controlling their neurons, so it wouldn't be a problem with out-of-body experience. And these two abilities would have no effect on Bone Man, Rita, and Saria, who were made of nothing but bones or armor, nor would they be useful against a Princess Olivia and the other ghosts. The mage Amasher that erased magic would be problematic, but against him, Vandalyu could activate the fragments of the Adiman King and kill him through physical means. Of course, he wouldn't mind letting Aborkus and Abelmond beat him to death either. In that regard, the Oracle and Clairvoyance would be problematic to find if they devoted themselves to running and hiding, but if they did that, Vandalyu would just leave them be.
But they are likely aware that Idan-Asama has erased Kaido Kainata, so would they not cooperate with each other if they were to attempt to take Idan-Asama's life once more? That would immediately increase our problems.
It would be immediately problematic if the Bravers formed a team and combined their abilities when fighting Vandalyu. And they weren't a group of people that were completely reliant on just their cheat-like abilities, either. Rodecourt had granted them increased physical qualities, and more importantly, a talent for magic.
Woog.
Seeing everyone's reactions, several of Allegiant's heads hung downwards in apology. It was probably regretting killing so many reincarnated individuals at once. It wasn't that it was suffering from the pressure of being hugged by Poavina.
From what I heard from Ehana and the others, Kaido Kainata tried to register at an adventurers guild and tried to acquire a job, though he was stopped partway through. Thus, I do not think they can acquire jobs naturally, even after reincarnating in this world. However, he was apparently quite a capable magic user, with numerous other skills as well.
The Bravers had all been first-rate magic users in origin, and had even received military training. But in Alamda, gunpowder-based firearms didn't exist, nor did Origin's state-of-the-art miniature magical media that could be fit into a glove, so it would likely be difficult for them to display their abilities right away. Using Kaido Kainata as a reference, if they were adventurers, they would be between C-class and B-class.
It's amazing that there are 100 of them, but are they really great enough to be called heroes?
In Alamda, there was a tough hurdle to make if one wanted to be known as a hero. Even if one became an A-class adventurer capable of cutting down mountains and splitting the sea, they would not be called heroes. One would have to become an S-class adventurer to call themselves a hero.
But if their base abilities are between C-class and B-class, if they acquire jobs and spend time training in Alamda, they'll become a class within a few years and S-class within a decade.
Alamda had bonuses from the jobs and skills that didn't exist in Origin, as well as monster materials and metals that didn't exist in Origin either. If the reincarnated individuals used those to gather their strength and equip themselves fully, it was possible that they could indeed gain the strength of a class adventurers. And if the reincarnated individuals cooperated with each other, they would become an extremely dangerous fighting force.
Well, it doesn't seem that all of the reincarnated individuals are on good terms with each other. Apparently they betrayed and killed each other back in the other world. Well, considering that, it's still uncertain as to whether they will try to kill me.
Even if Rodecourt promised them rewards, it was unlikely that they would form a party to challenge Vandalyu without facing risks of conflict.
Speaking of which, couldn't you predict what they'll do since you know what they're like, Your Majesty?
What are they like?
I don't know.
Vandalyu said, shaking his head.
I was never close enough to them to know what kind of people they are. And almost 30 years have passed. It wouldn't be strange if they've changed. In fact, it would be more normal if they have.
Vandalyu had been a loner without a single friend, but he at least remembered the names and faces of the classmates and teachers that had stood out. But looking at it another way, he couldn't remember anything other than that. And Allegiant's information had made it clear that since they had already been reincarnated once, there were some whose names and races had changed. Who in the world were Mackenzie, Emisa Anderson, and Mao Smith? If there had been students with those names at his high school, Vandalyu wouldn't have been able to forget them, no matter how of a loner he was. It was difficult to imagine that the passengers and workers on the ferry had these names, either. Though Vandalyu's memories were faint, he had the feeling that everyone on the ferry had been Japanese. And of course, there was no way that Vandalu knew the names and personalities of the ferry workers.
Ah, that's right. What will we do if those reincarnated people are reincarnated as babies born here?
Everyone was startled by this idea. The gods who knew of the secret of the circle of transmigration systems would be able to assure them that this couldn't happen, but that was a secret of gods. The people and monsters living in Talosheim had been guided to Avida's circle of transmigration system by a guidance Udiman path, and Rodakort couldn't interfere with them. But nobody knew this.
It's fine. Everyone loves Van.
Pavina declared, and the tense atmosphere diffused immediately.
That's true.
There's no problems there.
I suppose you're right.
You did it, Vandalu. It's because you behave well.
The truth was that this was due to the Ediman path enticement and the guidance Ediman path skills. However, all of Talosheim's citizens were currently under the influence of Vandalu's Ediman path enticement skill. If any foreign beings, not under the effects of these skills, were to appear among the citizens, Vandalu would be able to know right away.
Behaving well is important, isn't it?
Of course, this was a needless worry, as the reincarnated individuals were in a different circle of transmigration system, however.
Returning to the original topic, I think Legion knows more about the reincarnated individuals' natures than I do.
Legion had considered the Akronas, Murakami, and the other 9 reincarnated individuals under him as targets for revenge, so it hadn't colluded with him much at all, but they had been on cooperative terms for over a year. It was aware of their personalities to some extent.
According to Legion, Emarionette is considerably different from Kainata, and Deathiscythe is a little different, but both are similar to him.
I see they are serious enemies of women.
Olivia said she was close to Ahana and the other ghosts who had fallen victim to Kaido Koinata.
Van Kun, if they are scum bastards like Rick, we have to proactively go and kill them.
Orbia said, a victim of a conspiracy involving sham marriages and serial murder.
Adana-sama, it seems that they possess dangerous abilities, and as these 2 ladies say, I believe they should be disposed of immediately.
Abelman said, who had been a victim of a gang rape. It seemed that their past traumas were provoking their emotions, causing anger to well forth.
Indeed, if we can kill them, we should.
The Emarionette, Yinui Hajime, had apparently spoken to the female members of the 8th Guidance about the sex crimes he had stained his hands with using his cheat-like ability during his time with the Bravers, telling the stories as if they were tales of his own bravery. It had been serious harassment. The Death Scythe Koinoe Miyagi was similar. Since Vandalu only knew that Miyagi's ability could cause instant death by stopping the hearts of his targets, he assumed that Miyagi had threatened his victims with death, or perhaps killed them and defiled them afterwards. The truth was that Death Scythe was an ability that could stop any moving objects, like limbs and engines, not just hearts. Koinoe Miyagi's method had been to use this ability to stop the movements of his victims to commit his crimes. Because of his own behavior, the evilness of his crimes had been exaggerated. He had gotten what he deserved.
Also, the Oracle Enido Koiya Legion doesn't know what his personality is like, but due to various reasons, it's unclear as to whether he'll hear us out.
One of Allegiant's faces was changing shape as it let out its voice. The Oracle, Enido Koiya, had set up the way Vandalu had died in origin, and for that reason, the 8th Guidance member Shade had taken over his body and killed him. He seemed logical in nature, but Shade didn't know what he'd been thinking when he died. It was possible that he felt that his own death would offset what he had done to Vandalu, or even cancel it out.
On Earth, Shiemada Izumi-san was a person of firm character and a strong sense of justice. A class representative, kind of like a stubborn government official.
Vandalu recalled as he patted one of the grieving Allegiance heads. Aborkus and the others looked confused at first, but then seemed to understand once he gave the comparison.
I don't really get it, but is that bad?
It doesn't seem good, Basadia Nichin.
It means she has the kind of personality who would feel opposed to how fearsome Vandalu-sama is.
Kimberly and Elia Inora were frowning. It seemed that they had only negative impressions of stubborn government officials. If one thought about it using the common sense of someone from Earth, The things that Vandalyu had done were nothing but evil deeds. Vandalyu didn't know how much Shimada Iozumi had changed in origin, but wouldn't his past actions cause her to grimace now? The truth was that Enido Koiya and Shimada Iozumi were both people who would be relatively willing to discuss things with Vandalyu. But as long as Rodekort was the way he was, Vandalyu's ways of gaining information about what was happening on Rodekort's side was horribly limited. Because of this, he had actually ended up concluding that the opposite was true.
Well, her ability is apparently the Inspector, which allows her to see through falsities, and she's apparently not good at fighting, so she won't even be a threat if she appears before me. The other one that I know about is Miyanami Asagi. To describe him in a word, he's annoying.
Annoying as in he's a troublesome person.
They're all really troublesome people, aren't they? Van Kun, you suddenly seem really tired.
Indeed, Vandalyu's impression of Asagi was that troublesome or annoying would describe him in a word. He was a sports-oriented person in the sports club, enthusiastic in everything he did and constricting in his friendships, with a hot-blooded personality. And he forced his sense of values onto others. No, he was a man who believed that it was a good deed to force others to do what he thought was right, and believed it was his duty to do so. To those with the same or similar senses of values as Asagi, or those who found comfort and happiness in companionship, Asagi was probably a good person. However, in the past, he had been nothing more than a nuisance to Vandalyu. Vandalyu didn't care about the fact that he had organized a signed card to be given to a reserved teacher in training when he returned to his university. But what about the fact that he would force students who weren't in any club to join as a trial, and then give a fervent speech about the significance of high school life to those students when they quit? Back then, everyone liked him except for our homeroom teacher, and he was respected among the class, so nobody stopped him, and it was really troublesome. Back on Earth, Vandalyu had always become caught up in the arguments that Asagi started. It wasn't that Asagi had been really targeting him, but because he had been living a completely opposite school life to Asagi, he had always been given instructions by him.
Time has passed since then, and he should have gone through a different environment, so I don't think he would have the same personality that he did back then, but including his time on Earth, he should have lived a total of 47 or 48 years. If I lived in that environment the whole time, I might have died of mental fatigue. He got an unpleasant feeling just remembering Miyanami Asagi. That was the kind of person Asagi was. However, from the actions and words of Asagi in Allegiance Memories, Vandalyu got the strange feeling that he had become even worse.
Vandalyu die of fatigue.
For Van, who is fine after doing 3 days worth of work in a day, to say that he'd die of fatigue.
Q, quite the troublesome person, isn't he?
Eidan-sama, could that not be considered a unique skill?
No, it's not that bad.
Everyone was shuddering. They seemed more shocked than Vandalyu had expected they would be. Vandalyu had told them what kind of a world Earth was, but it seemed that they couldn't help but to think of it in terms of Olamda and the current Vandalyu.
Well, it's fortunate that Murakami-sensei didn't die.
Murakami Junpei, the homeroom teacher of Vandalyu's high school class on Earth. From Vandalyu's memory, Murakami had done his duties as a teacher in an ordinary way, but outside of that, he was an extremely troublesome person. He had completely left the task of guiding the students to Asagi, and he was certainly not the type that students could consult regarding their family situations or their futures. Vandalyu's uncle and aunt wouldn't give him the money needed for the school trip. He still remembered what Murakami had said to him when he came to school with the documents he needed to be allowed to work part-time in order to earn his own money and pay for the trip himself.
It'll make no difference whether or not you're there. Do you really want to go on this school trip that badly?
And then he had shown great annoyance as he signed it for approval. Vandalyu's life on Earth had ended as a result of participating in the school trip, so he didn't resent Murakami for this, however.
What I'm concerned about is that Murakami-sensei is the one who changed the most after reincarnating in Origin.
It wasn't too difficult to imagine someone in his teenage years like Kaido Koinata, drowning in his suddenly acquired power in his second life and recklessly committing crimes. But Murakami Junpei had been an adult at the time of his death, and though he hadn't been a good teacher, he hadn't been a criminal or a lowlife either. He had betrayed, tricked, and killed his fellow reincarnated individuals, the students of the class that he had been the homeroom teacher of. How had he fallen so far? Vandalyu found this strange. Therefore, he couldn't imagine how Murakami would think or act when he reincarnated in Alamda. It would have been fortunate for Vandalyu if Murakami had stayed alive in Origin, giving him time to gather more information about him from the other reincarnated individuals. That was what Vandalyu thought, unaware that Murakami had already died.
Now then, that's the complete report for the present situation. If Ulijin remembers any new information, please listen to me as I explain it once more. Also, I'm going to publish this information on the front page of the Eclipse King Post.
The Eclipse King Post. This was the newspaper that had recently started to be published in Talosheim. It was generally published monthly and contained news of events in the various regions of Talosheim, events being held and information of the outside world delivered by the Asuran Liberation Front that was led by Iris. Incidentally, the editor-in-chief and reporter was Vandalyu himself. There was an open position for people worried about the unification of the government and the press.
That thing has too many kanji, so I don't do well with it. Can you use more hiragana?
And Your Majesty, I accidentally burn it sometimes, so I would like you to make the Eclipse King Post more fire-resistant.
I'd like it to be more water-resistant.
Then, add more crossword puzzles.
Priyavel, you should learn more kanji, but it might be true that it's not really well suited for the general population, so I'll take that into consideration. Princess Olivia and Orbia, please put a little more effort into controlling your flames and water. If you really can't, then I'll consider your suggestions. Povina, I'm planning to publish a compilation of the crossword puzzles that you like. Please wait a little longer. Incidentally, the second page will be an introduction of Legion.
Indeed, if you don't introduce it and someone were to encounter it, they might mistake it for a new species of monster.
And so, the head of the nation and those close to him determined the newspaper's contents. Nobody had the role of monitoring the authority of Talosheim's information source. And then just as Vandalyu tried to end the morning debriefing session in a peaceful manner, Shezara came to deliver some news.
Your Majesty, there has been a report from Bone Man who has been patrolling the marshlands. It seems that there is something strange occurring at the southern end of the marshes. It is likely that there is something unusual going on in the Innoble Orc Empire. I believe we should deal with it immediately.
Indeed, it seems better to deal with that than the reincarnated individuals since we don't know when they'll arrive. Station guards at the southern end of the marshes. After that, let's form a squad to see what's going on.
There was the possibility that the reincarnated individuals had reincarnated in Alamda in adult bodies like Kaido Kainata, but even if they did, their abilities would be around B-class level. With abilities on that level, it would be difficult for them to cross the boundary a mountain range, even if they formed a party. Thus, Vandalyu thought that it was best to leave the Asuran Liberation Front to stay on guard, while he and his companions dealt with the neighboring Innoble Orc Empire.
Now then, I'll announce the criteria for being selected for the squad.